Today to talk about the really big issues. We are living through a time of unprecedented and cumulative crises. What with obviously the pandemic situation and the recession situation and a global crisis of racism that continues, and of course the big one that's going to kill us all, climate change, which has to be a part of every other discussion, I think, and needs to be woven through all our political solutions to all the other issues. We need to have a focus on how climate change and that massive existential threat to our societies can be included, and how we need to change our politics to address that. And just at this time of multiple intersecting crises, we are being led around the world by right-wing, populist, nationalist, inward-looking regimes. And so we're in a very dangerous place to be confronting such terrible crises, and we are at risk of completely failing to address these urgent issues in ways that protect the interests of all being both globally and within societies. So I'm giving the not insignificant task to our panel now to talk to us a bit about how we can restructure our entire politics and what we can do to save the world from these multiple threats, and how we need to reimagine our society coming out of this pandemic. You know, is it an opportunity to push for massive change? If it is, what needs to be done? How can we put climate change, as I say, weave it into every other part of our political agenda so that we can truly survive? So I will not babble on anymore, but we'll hear from the experts. So first of all, we're going to hear from Jonathan Bartley. He's the co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. I think I'll go through everybody, and then, yeah. After hearing from Jonathan, we'll hear from Asad Rehman, Director of War on Want and climate justice activist. And then finally, we will hear from Minnie Rahman, colleague of mine at the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. She's campaigns officer there, manager actually, my brief is wrong. And she writes on the intersection of climate and migration. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jonathan. Yes, over to you.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Zoe, for inviting me to speak today, and thanks, amazing Asad and Minnie, for having me on the panel with them both. As you said, Zoe, that there's no doubt we're living through a time of intersecting crisis, not just the COVID crisis, not just an economic crisis, crisis of a potential crash out of Brexit, remember that one, not about a crisis of violence, systemic racism and oppression either on its own. And not only the climate and ecological crisis, we're living through a collapse of internationalism. At the very moment, we are living through the complete collapse of our life support systems. This is the crisis to top all crises. And it's very clear we are at a crossroads, a fork in the road on which so many lives depend. Down one road, there's the drive to return to business as usual, an attempt to use the same tools, the same methods that got us into these crises in the first place, using them to try and get us out of it. And let's not forget that even extends to future viruses, which scientists are now warning us stem from our exploitation of the natural world. So an attempt to conjure up more growth from the ashes of our economy through more consumerism and debt, more injustice, more oppression, more inequality. And that will mean using the same oppressive system, stoking up more division, doubling down on nationalism, because it's the politics of divide, exploit, and oppress that are the foundations of this old system. And all the while charging headlong towards complete climate breakdown. So that's one of the roads we can take. The other is something entirely new, system change. The other road to creating an economy that provides for everyone while living within the limits of our planet. An economy that liberates, that encourages us to collaborate in our common endeavor, where the enemy is not one another, but the things that hold us back from creating a better world, a politics where we build bridges across borders rather than walls, a world that pulls us back from cliff edges we are careering towards, that asks who the economy is for and starts to measure what really does matter. So this is the choice that we face. And the reality is that the decisions we make over the next few months, let alone the next few years, will send us down one of those paths, and there will be pretty much no turning back. And so it will come as no surprise that the first step down that road I believe we need to take is to demand a green recovery. We must resist any return to austerity. Yes, public debt is approaching new levels that we haven't seen before, but public debt is the lifeline that enables us to address the crises that we face. And as we stare down the barrel of one of the most severe recessions we've ever had, there's no question that some sort of massive emergency stimulus package is needed. And the bigger danger is that we miss this moment and we repeat the mistakes of the last financial crisis, doubling down on business as usual yet again and failing to bring about the systemic change through that financial stimulus that is desperately needed. And of course, back then, climate breakdown wasn't on the agenda really in the last financial crisis. There were no school strikers, there was no Extinction Rebellion, there was no Black Lives Matter. So this is the time, I believe, for a popular, powerful intersectional movement with these ideas leading the agenda. Around the world, we're seeing more and more countries setting net zero targets alongside Green New Deal packages. And in the 2019 general election, the Green Party pledged to spend 100 billion a year on climate action every year for the next 10 years through borrowing. And that's what I believe we have to push for as a recovery from the COVID crisis and also to address the climate crisis. Millions of green jobs, purposeful work, meaningful time off, a universal basic income which lets no one fall through the cracks, an economy that lifts up communities while driving down emissions. And I don't believe this is a utopian future. We can look to our past to see parallels. After the abject crisis of World War II, what do? We didn't sit around stressing about the debt to GDP ratio, even though debt was far higher as a proportion of GDP. We didn't worry that people might become addicted to state support. When we saw the situation we were in, we saw the opportunity in front of us, and we rose to that moment. We set up the NHS, we set up the welfare state, an unprecedented program of house building. We emerged from crisis the stronger because we're ambitious, not cautious, because we had vision and we were prepared to be bold. And we can do the same thing for the 21st century. We can rise to meet this moment. We can have a green recovery from this crisis. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. Naomi Klein said it really well when she said that climate change is victim of especially bad timing because it's landed in the lap of the high watermark of neoliberalism, the ideology which seeks to shrink the state, the public sphere, and all the tools we have to deal with the crisis. And she's right, it's terrible timing. But that's nothing compared to the bad timing we have on our hands at this precise moment. Just as the sands are going through the hourglass of the final years and months, we have to pull back from the brink of complete climate breakdown. The world order is fragmenting into broken shards. And we can see that in our response to COVID-19. You'd think it was a global pandemic that would unite us in a common purpose, but instead we've seen nations fighting like dogs over choked supply chains of PPE, everyone pursuing their own form of lockdown, quarantine, track and trace, what feels like a million different vaccines under development. We need a global response that works together to fix a global problem. And we need proper leadership that will reach out and inspire hope. And right now, we all know we have the opposite. In this country, it was Brexit, but the virus of nationalism has taken root here and around the world. And we're fragmenting at a time when we need internationalism and cooperation more than ever. And we're not just fragmenting between nations, we're fragmenting within nations. At the same time as driving us back towards nationalism, our leaders are stoking up the far right like never before. It's coming right from the top. Last year, my co-leader Sean Berry spoke at another Europe rally where fascists mobilized on the street in a way that we hadn't seen in years. It was the first time in history, as far as I know, that an organized fascist group chanted the name of a sitting prime minister in the UK. Boris was their guy, just as white supremacists in the US know Trump as their guy. And now, just a week ago, of course, we saw one of the biggest far-right demonstrations in the UK for quite some time. This is where we've ended up. This is what the crisis looks like. So as we stand at this crossroads, it's so obvious to me which path we must take. And it's obvious to most of us, I think, here. And what this crisis is doing is exposing the rampant inequality and injustice that so many people, was hidden from so many people. And I think there's a cause for optimism, because once that injustice is exposed, it's very hard to go back. And only 9% of people, according to some of the latest polling in the UK, want to go back to the way things were before lockdown, because the way things were back then wasn't working. And this has often been the way in previous crises. If you look back to the Boer War, the First World War, that exposed the terrible health of working men, and it then laid the foundations for our National Health Service. When men went off to fight in the Second World War, women came into the labour market to do what previously seen only as men's jobs, and there was no going back once it was seen that, of course, women can do men's jobs. And in this crisis, what we've seen is injustice further exposed, the disproportionate health impacts on people of colour, the low levels of sick pay and universal credit, the inequality of whether you have access to green space. And at the same time, we've also seen that change is possible, whether it's businesses adapting, more working from home, cleaner air, 60 days without using coal in our energy supply, tearing down statues, reclaiming streets, forcing the government to provide food for hungry children over the summer, or even that it's key workers, not bankers, on whom our well-being and security truly depends. So the injustice must be amplified, but the voices of those who are suffering injustice must be amplified, those who are oppressed. But the possibility that a better world is possible must also be amplified. And here in the UK, I think we need to think big, bigger than we've ever thought before, in order to come out of these overlapping, intersecting crises. We need to organise our broadest, most diverse movement yet to push the government for this green recovery, to build alliances from those who are fighting climate breakdown to those who are fighting deportations and the hostile environment, between those who are fighting racism and those who are fighting the exploitation of the natural world, recognising that their struggle is our struggle is their struggle. And when it comes to the internationalism, we've got to think even bigger. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference, which set a new international order after the crises of the 1930s. And we should do the same today. Next year, Britain also hosts COP26. And we should make the links and celebrate the anniversary by holding a conference among nations, I think, to decide on a fair and sustainable financial architecture for a post-COVID world. That nothing should be off the table. We should look at reparations. We should look at dropping the debt for developing nations. We should create a new reserve currency and end the stranglehold of the dollar. We should put a recovery for people and planet at the heart of a new global order. In all these crises, I believe there is a moment, there is opportunity, there is hope. And we've seen that hope being written right now in our local communities up and down the country. We have learned lessons of the financial crash, and this time we are ready. I believe we can build better. It's always darkest before the dawn, but I do believe that our best days really are ahead of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was really inspiring. I'm glad you ended on a note of hope. And I think I agree with you that, you know, even in this moment where we are, the leaders of the world are so against us, we are actually seeing a really inspiring moment for leadership from below and these street movements and so on that you've referred to. So hopefully this is something that can really provide real hope and tangible change. Thank you very much. I'm going to move straight on to Asad Rehman, Director of War on One. Asad, take it away.
Thank you, Zoe. Hi to everybody. I might do the depressing bit first then. Although I have a lot to say about the vision and the strategy about how we build a movement of movements and what we need to do going forward. I think it's important for us as progressive activists actually to also root ourselves in the realities. And I think for a long time, a lot of people on what I would call the progressive left and even the green left, you know, don't actually locate the reality of the crisis and the multiple crises that we face. I remember when I first joined into what I would call as a reluctant environmentalist fighting the systems of oppression into started working around climate, and I often used to be told we're all on the Titanic together, right? And climate is something that affects us all, and we're heading towards the proverbial iceberg, and we're about to hit it. I think the reality is, of course, we are all on the iceberg, but on the top deck of the iceberg still sits the overwhelmingly the citizens of the global north, the rich and the powerful, sipping cocktails, listening to the orchestra, hoping there's going to be some miraculous technological answer that's going to take people out of it. Where in the hold are the people of the global south, black and brown people, who are already drowning, and when they try and escape the hold of the Titanic, they find themselves locked in. So I think centering the reality of the crisis and where it's been impacted, I think is really, really important. Look, we all know the killer floods, droughts, famines that are killing millions of people all around the world, devastating people's lives and livelihoods. You know, I think what's important to know is what we were told, these impacts were all going to happen at 2 degrees warming, not at 1 degree warming. And when the movements of the global south called for temperatures to be limited to below 1 degree, they were called radical. And the mainstream movements and political parties and the environment movement called for a 2 degree target a decade ago. Look, don't need to tell all of you of what that devastation has looked like. We've seen it. You don't need to be a climate scientist now. We've seen what happened to Mozambique. We've seen Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Dominica, flattened, you know, each of those, just one storm taking out 224% of the GDP of the small islands. We saw when Mozambique was hit by cyclones, 1 million people on the brink of starvation, not because of the cyclone itself, it's because over decades we have gutted Mozambique through first colonial imposition, imperial wars, structural adjustment programs, so much so that Mozambique had to come to the City of London to beg for more debt-creating loans to be able to feed its own people. Over last summer, India's 5th biggest city, Chennai, ran out of water. By 2030, it's predicted that something like 40% of India's 1.3 billion people will be without access to fresh water. I mean, I could go on and on about the litany of what this climate crisis. And I know many people in the global north, particularly the new movements, all got sparked by the 2018 report on 1 degree, on what the dangers of breaching the 1.5 degree guardrail was going to be. And it sent a shockwave, and it spurred, everything from Extinction Rebellion to the youth climate strikers, etc. But I just want to also locate that in some reality as well. So often, most of us have probably seen this now famous champagne glass, the 10% of the world's population responsible for 50% of global emissions, the poorest 50% only responsible for 10%. I think what's really important for us is to overlay that with the other champagne glass, the champagne glass of inequality. Because when you overlay that, you suddenly realize what you see is that the climate issue is not an issue about carbon. It's a structural issue about what I would call racialized capitalism, about systems of oppression and sacrifice in the global south. Because what you see is half the world at the moment, 3.5 billion people live on less than $5 a day. We've got 2 billion people going without access to food. We've got 1 billion people without access to clean water. We've got 3.5 billion people either without access to clean electricity or clean cooking. The inequalities of the world are exactly the same inequalities of the climate crisis. And of course, that's not because there isn't enough wealth. In fact, as we know, inequality is going off the charts. The rich are getting richer, not just the top 1%, but also overwhelmingly the global north. And I think there's some lessons for us to learn, because often people talk about the response to the climate crisis as being a dial back before neoliberalism. Dial back to Keynesianism, where there was a better redistribution of wealth in the global north, but only at the expense of the global south. The same systems of extraction and oppression continued. Dial back to colonialism, dial back to imperialism. Where do you want to dial back to? Our challenge is to be able to dial forward to a different world. I think the second thing I want to just say something about the climate science and this whole bollocks about net zero that you hear all the time. When the IPCC put out that report, and talked about the graph for 1.5. What would be shocking in you to see in that is, you know, most of the predictions rely on unproven technology, right? On net emissions technology. The idea that you can suck carbon out of the atmosphere and somehow push it back. Yes, we can do more tree cover, afforestry, reforestation, etc. But overwhelmingly, it's unproven technology, apart from bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which you'd need 3 times the landmass of India. And I'm sorry, there's no 3 times the landmass of India lying around somewhere waiting for us to be able to carry on as business as usual. So the other thing that the IPCC talked about is, of course, this, you know, the world needs to be at 0 by 2050. Well, what that meant was the rich countries like ours need to be at 0 by 2030 to allow poorer countries greater time to be able to reduce their emissions and tackle poverty and inequality. Now, and even in that, and I want to just say, even with that, the IPCC calculated there's 360 gigatons of CO2 left in the atmosphere, which, if you look at the current carbon budget, is about 8.5 years. And then you look at probability, it's about 50-50 chance. So really, if we were really serious about tackling the climate crisis, we'd say we've got about 5 years of the carbon budget to prevent a breach of the 1.5, knowing what the devastation is going to happen through all the feedback loops that were going to occur. Look, the IPCC set it out, what it would mean both for the global economy, access to food, water, the destruction of lives and livelihoods, forced displacement of people, that is going to happen. So I think often people think about climate as an existential crisis that's on the horizon. The realities of the climate crisis has been a reality for many people in the global south. So I think I just want to put that. And I think the reason why that happens, you can only understand the reason why that happens if you understand the historical exploitation of the global south, right? That this arc, you can only understand it if you go back to the doctrine of discovery, if you think about slavery, if you think about colonialism, imperialism, because this logic of extraction of wealth, of resources and people underpins all of those dimensions. And, you know, I know recently there's been a lot more attention and about slavery, and it's great. After many years, most of us will be saying, well, you know, actually the global south built the UK, built the global north, right? And we all now are much more au fait with the fact that British traders enslaved 1.5 million people of African descent. The wealth of that was calculated. It was calculated about £8 billion that was invested into the British industrial revolution. It's in every bricks and mortar of this country. It set up our banks from Barclays. And even when we know that slavery was so-called ended here in the UK, the Bank of England, our financial institution, continued to profit from it. And we know all of that. We know how, you know, Britain, you know, established itself in terms of through slavery. I could talk also about colonialism, right? I'm from the Indian subcontinent. I was born in Pakistan. When the British came to India, India's GDP was about 24%. When they left, it was less than 4%. It's calculated that Britain took out 45 trillion from India alone, let alone how much they took out of Africa, Caribbean, or anywhere else. It said that Britain never spent a single penny of its own money on its imperial adventures or its capitalist expansion into the new settlements in Canada, Australia. Those all came from the looting of the global south. And I want to say that, and I'm locating that because often, again, the answer, or when we have this discussion about climate, there's a tendency to look within the nation state. And I think there's when we look at, you know, even from colonialism to imperialism, we have a report out, you know, New Colonialism, which looks at, for example, the mining and extractive industry of Africa. And what's incredible is if you look at the map of Africa now, and then the map of Africa is in terms of during colonial times, you'll see an incredible parallel between what was extracted where and when, and who still controls that wealth. Currently, in the City of London, the British mining companies control £1 trillion worth of wealth of mineral wealth of sub-Saharan Africa. That's more than the entire GDP of every country combined in sub-Saharan Africa. That's the amount of mineral and metal wealth that we can currently control. So But imperialism and neoliberalism, they're not a legacy, they're a reality for us today. Now, we often in this conversation about climate, we're sometimes shocked about the numbers, right? And, we've done a calculation. So if Britain was to do its fair share of effort, to keep temperatures below 1.5, the UK would have to be at 0 by 2030, plus it would have to transfer 1 trillion just to meet its mitigation costs. That's not costs of adaptation, that's not costs of loss and damage, which are incalculable around the world, just in terms of mitigation. And then when you look at the scale of the finance that's talked about, even by progressive ends of the environment movement, we talk about 10 billions, we talk about 100 billion. We don't talk about the finance that's required for this global transformation that's required globally. Now, some of you all are well aware, that just since the 1980s, 16 trillion has flowed in capital profits from the global south to our banks and to the global north. 13 trillion is hidden in secret tax avoidance and tax havens. The global south has paid close to 4.5 trillion in unsustainable debt back to the global north. And I say all of that because much of the conversation about how we respond to both the corona, the climate, the neoliberal inequality crisis uses the same market tools and is basically saying to the global south, the only answer is more debt creating loans. The only answer is more privatization. The only answer is more opening of your economies. And we know, right, we say that Corona, providing an X-ray on the inequalities in our own country, and of course it did, right, between how Corona has affected people in this country, but the tools that the UK government was able to use to protect the health of its citizens, invest in public services, try and control the economy, its furlough programs, none of those tools are available in terms of the global south. And so whilst people in the global north were celebrating pictures of bears and deers and boars and saying nature is recovering, migrants in India were walking and starving to death. People in Ecuador were lying and buried in the streets. Like the reality for people like in Sierra Leone, where you have 0.8% of a doctor for every 10,000 people. And here in Europe, we have an average of about 48 to 30. That is because our structural adjustment programs prevented many economies of the global south from having any of those tools that are available to them. Now, I say all of those things because I think when we really think about this movement, what we need to build in terms of a movement, yes, we need to combine our movements, right? We of course recognize that the corona pandemic has exposed global inequalities. We know that already the international financial institutions are talking about a stimulus package of 9.7 trillion already. But within that 9.7 trillion, when the IMF talked about that the global south needs 2.5 trillion just to deal with the pandemic now, hardly any money has been put on the table. We know that the response to the corona pandemic, like the response to climate, was not global. It was a competition for PPE. It was a retreat to the nation state. And I think that says a lot to us about what will also happen with the climate crisis. That instead of this being a global moment that we challenge and address things globally, the retreat to the nation state, that you see both in the progressive element of our own movement. And if you look at most of the formulations, for example, around the Just Recovery, Build Back Better, the Green New Deals that have operated in the global north, all of them, of course, do an amazing thing because they've done something that for many of us have argued for a very, very long time, which is you cannot fight the climate crisis until you fight the crisis of economic inequality. We can't do that because we need to build the social rights. At the front and center of our mind should be that banner at the Gilets Jaunes demonstration from a couple of years ago. The elites worry about the end of the world. Ordinary people worry about the end of the month. And unless we combine those two, we'll never build social rights. But we have lost internationalism in that fight because we've said, yes, let's look at our nation state. So now we don't look at the resource extraction that's required to power our recovery. So we've got the Chancellor talking about 2 million green new jobs. We've got the Prime Minister talking about using the word build back better and a green resilience. We've got the Bank of England talking about green stimulus packages. And what they have largely, of course, ignored is the global architecture of finance, of banking, of trade. They ignore not about debt, but the reparations that are needed from the global north to the global south for our recovery. And of course, what they ignore is the resources that are required. And those are not just about the rare earth minerals and metals that we simply don't have around the world to be able to power electric batteries for electric cars. You know, we've estimated you'd need about 423% of known reserves of cobalt and titanium. It's also the huge metal and copper extraction that's required. The OECD says that what we're going to see is a doubling of material extraction from around the world. Currently, a sustainable limit would be about 50 billion tons. We're about 80. We're going to double that to about 160. The OECD says we're going to see 111% increase in metal extraction. And that really brings us to that question of what is the future and what is the vision that we're going to have. So absolutely, we can only win the climate crisis if we also win the crisis and fight the crisis about neoliberal inequality. We can only do that if we also center the reality of racialized capitalism and historic exploitation. Is there a vision that can do that? Absolutely. Look, we've been working on a global Green New Deal that says you cannot win this, not just by saying to people, you will have a universal basic income. We need social protection and public services and workers' rights in the global south. We've seen the reality of what happened with the corona pandemic. As supply chains shut down here and people were put on furlough, workers in the global south were laid off, totally destitute. And now we're seeing a massive rollback in labour rights across the world as people are sacked and then rehired on workers' rights that are basically taken away 10 years of workers' struggle. We have to think about how we embed that. Of course, we know that we have to think about, we know at the centre of the climate crisis is this question, how do we produce, consume food and energy? We know that. But that is not going to be delivered to us by green technology or by simply greening that consumption. I think it's a much more profound conversation we need to be having, which is what about public ownership of energy and food? Who owns our energy systems and our food system? What is our energy and food systems for? And who gets access to them? So I think the right to food and energy has to be a central part. And of course, that means we have to dismantle not just the fossil fuel industry, it means dismantling the agribusiness, but it also means recognizing that for the global south, the control of those food and energy systems is very, very, very important. As Jonathan said, we're in this critical moment. There is going to be a huge debate about what the global economy looks like. In 2008, they were able to rescue the global economy by capitalizing, by doing massive investment. This shock that we're facing now in the global recession is something much bigger than that. It's estimated half of all jobs in the global south will go. The World Bank, even the most radical of institutions are talking about that currently 420 million more people are going to be pushed into extreme poverty. That's living on less than $1.25 a day. And what is the answer for the global south? Well, we've seen it. In the commodity prices have collapsed 37%. And many of us, the fossil fuels, prices are going down, renewables are up there. But it's also meant that the global south has lost 800 billion in the very resources it needs to be able to provide support and services and function as a state. And so the global south is only faced with a paradox. Does it produce more commodities to sell to the global north to be able to have even less and less income to be able to meet the crisis that it's facing? Or is there going to be some profound change? And at the moment, I have to say much of that conversation is still absent from most of the sort of Green Deal kind of conversations that are taking place. I don't know how long have I got left. I've got a minute left. Yep, I've got a minute left. Look, you know, I think many of us, you know, for a long time always talked about, you know, the rise of eco-fascism. And we looked at generation identity, you know, when it did its, you know, save the bees, save the trees, deport refugees. And we said, look, we had them and we said, oh, but look, most of the right are climate denialists. Look at Bolsonaro, look at Trump, etc. I think what's actually, for me, the bigger danger of what we're coming towards is a sort of normalizing of that eco-fascism, where people look at what's happened with the corona pandemic and say, the first and foremost thing we must do is protect ourselves. That means walls and fences. That means we have to protect our nation state. And that's not just about UK, that is as Europe. That will be the global north to the global south, right? Where the rich create a wall between them. When the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, produced a report on climate and inequality, he said this sentence in there. He said, we're heading towards climate apartheid, where the rich will have the resources to be able to protect themselves from rising heat and sea level water, etc. And we will sacrifice the poor to heat waves and death and destruction. That climate apartheid has always existed. It's going to actually get much worse. So I do think we're in a portal. We're at this moment. The next step isn't actually one that is likely one to be that we will applaud. It's not. The reality is that the forces we already see, the forces of disaster capitalism, moving much quicker. We've seen with the stimulus packages that it's going to the entrenched fossil fuel and big industry. But our challenge, particularly us collectively, in the next 18 months, when, you know, as Jonathan said again, you know, we've got the anniversary of Bretton Woods, we're hosting the G7, we're hosting the COP26, is to actually rebuild an internationalist climate justice movement in this country, which centers both the struggle against neoliberalism, climate, and racialized capitalism. It's the only answer that we potentially are able to have, and I look forward to having more of that discussion and tell you a little bit more about that. Okay, I'll shut up.
Thank you so much, Asad. That was, I mean, just such a wide-ranging polemic, really good stuff in there. And I fully agree on this need to rebuild internationalism. And hopefully we are seeing a level of engagement on sort of a global civic space that is emerging in terms of like hunger and protests, but really making people understand. It's hard enough to make people give a damn about poor people in our own country who they should be able to identify with, but making people recognize exactly what you're saying, how the global poor are being sacrificed here in devastating numbers is really important as we go into those international forums. So thank you so much for all of that. Loads of food for thought. I'm going to move on to my brilliant colleague Minnie now, who is from JCWI. Take it away, Minnie.
Hi everyone. I'm kind of inclined to just say everything that Asad and Jonathan said and you can ignore me, but I think it's actually really important that we sort of double down into borders and migrants' rights in the context of the climate crisis. So as Zoe mentioned, I work for an organisation called the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. So we're one of the oldest migrants' rights charities in the UK. We provide immigration advice to all kinds of migrants, from asylum seekers, people trying to reunite with their families, to people who've been undocumented in the UK for 20 years without a recognised status. And we use the experience of our clients to inform the work we do and call on the government to push for change and level up their rights. And more recently, we've begun to think more holistically about the movement of migrants across borders and what that looks like in the context of climate change, for all the reasons that Asad and Jonathan have mentioned, and particularly in the context of growing nationalism and a decline of internationalism, increased racialized inequality, and the lasting effects of capitalism and colonialism. And we've recognized that as the climate crisis continues to worsen, without radical action, there will be a severe impact on the people that we work with and people across the globe. And really importantly, as an organisation and as activists, as we are constantly trying to push against anti-migrant narratives to get fundamental change, we've really seen that there's a need to unite different movements and collectively work together to achieve systemic change, and for people in the climate movement to understand their role in levelling up the rights of all migrants. The climate movement historically in the UK has basically ignored the relationship between migration and climate change, and have often contributed to xenophobic narratives about migrants, and have acted completely in silo to the experiences of people across the globe. And ecofascism has been a real problem in the left and for the climate movement. And we still see many climate activists talking about population control instead of the systemic injustice that's been set out by Asad and Jonathan. And, you know, even just as an example, you know, talking about mass migration and that's what will happen as a result of the climate crisis actually invokes the frames of the far right, and it tells us to act on the climate crisis, or we'll see a terrible increase in migration, and, you know, reinforces the idea that migration is bad and something to be afraid of. and it doesn't recognise and centre the impacts of people across the world. And we have historically focused on the impacts of the climate crisis here and how we can prevent them from happening to us and what we can do as individuals to modify our behaviour. But for communities in the global south, the climate crisis has long been a reality, and the impacts on movement are incredibly notable. So for millions of people, migration is already an adaptation to the climate crisis. That is how they are modifying their behaviour in order to manage the effects of changing climates, droughts, hurricanes, floods, sea level rise. Those are all forcing people to move and displacing them from their homes. I think last year 23 million people were forced to move due to climate and weather-related disasters. And thinking about coronavirus, we're not even sure what the impacts of that have been on movement. But if you try and think about how movement will be affected if there's a sort of typhoon and then you have to move to emergency accommodation, and that doesn't help you protect you from coronavirus. And that shows how health and migration are intimately connected. These things can't be separated. And it's also not just disasters that force people to move. The environment changes really slowly. And if you think about land becoming impossible to farm, temperatures increasing, coastlines eroding, people have to make the choice to move to places where they're able to work and can provide for their families. And even the most ambitious plans to halt the climate crisis still commit the planet to more warming, and that warming will continue to alter environmental patterns, and people will continue to be displaced regardless of how fast we cut emissions. So we have to think about migration as one of the most important homegrown climate adaptation strategies. But across Europe, we haven't seen any recognition from leaders. Even globally, even further in Europe, we haven't seen any recognition that we need to facilitate that movement rather than hinder it. And instead, we have chosen to vilify migrants, treat them as a problem, bar them from accessing vital support services, even when we have caused the crises that has caused them to move. And obviously the UK is at the forefront of not only propagating those views, but creating systems which continually strip migrants of their rights, treats them as second-class citizens, and particularly those who arrive from countries in the global south. So European leaders, in the context of coronavirus and the climate crisis, have to think about how they can deal with movement in a way that protects people's rights and keeps them safe. And they have two very different options. They can try to stop people from moving, which will lead to something that looks like a crisis as people reach harder and harder borders, or they can help people migrate out of the most badly hit areas, or provide them with infrastructure that allows them to mitigate the effects of the crisis in the places where they live and stay. And we all already know what happens when the government prevents desperate people from moving, and that is that they will move anyway, especially if they have no choice to do that. People will cross seas in rubber boats, they will climb walls, they will board lorries, and the only people who will benefit from that system are the people who are willing to exploit those people. And that system is the system that leads to people dying in their homes from climate crisis impacts or dying at a border. So what we can do is facilitate climate-linked migration in a legal and organised way. Now, obviously, we had a migration system that worked and that did that, and that was free movement, and we're trying to get rid of it. So trying to protect free movement and extend it in an organised way is really important for the climate crisis. And I think in that context of Brexit and getting rid of free movement and the far right being extremely empowered in the UK, I think we have to pay attention to what the government is currently doing. We've already seen the government try and place the blame for the spread of coronavirus on people who are crossing borders. And there is a real risk that the UK's response to coming out of the pandemic will mean an increase in nationalism and a narrative which further talks about controlling borders, even when we have an extremely hard border regime that would not have protected people from the impacts of coronavirus. So, as much as the government might want to spin it, permanently hardened borders is not the solution to a global health pandemic, which is what the climate crisis is in many ways. So that's something that we have to be incredibly wary of, and that climate activists have to take action on together. And coronavirus has presented us with like a significant opportunity. It's a significant moment to reimagine our economy and our society and to change the narrative around the climate crisis and migration. And as Asad mentioned, to put those who are most affected at the centre of all of our solutions. So we need to think about how we reframe the economy to encompass reparations and redistribution for those who are most affected, how we can share technology with those in the global south that will protect them, and how we can view healthcare, housing, food and water as a global right. So what that looks like in the UK and for us who work on migrants' rights and on climate in the UK is that we have to ensure that migrants have the same rights that we do, and that they are encompassed in any efforts for a green recovery or a Green New Deal. So that looks like ensuring that people can cross borders safely and that movement can be facilitated. That looks like ensuring that undocumented people in the UK are not subject to the hostile environment, which stops them from working, accessing support services, housing and healthcare. And we're really looking at a new deal for migrants, which puts undocumented people out of the informal economy and back into the legal economy, particularly as we start thinking about a post-coronavirus exit strategy, because those are the people who have been keeping the country going without recognition. They are often carers, cleaners, security guards, they work in construction, they work in all the industries without any rights and are heavily exploited. And those are the kind of people that need to be brought back into the economy when we're thinking about economic recovery. And as a movement, I think if we're just thinking about the way that the climate movement works at the moment, we have to find a way to unite our actions so that they speak both to structural injustice and to the impacts of the climate crisis. You know, I can think of loads of examples off the top of my head, but the one that really strikes me often is that we have had a climate movement that has been heavily opposed to the Heathrow third runway and has made much progress on that and basically won half the battle. But as part of airport expansion plans in Heathrow, there are still plans to build a super detention centre there, which would violate so many human rights. You know, detention centres are the embodiment of incarceration and involved from slavery and capitalism and colonialism, are the same things that directly cause the climate crisis. And, you know, we've had no connection between those two things, and that's something that that climate activists should be opposing wholeheartedly, and the kind of action that makes clear that our movements are parallel and that we're fighting the same injustices and are acting in solidarity with the people who have been most affected by the climate crisis. You know, and I just want to finish by saying that I think, you know, what we're talking about here is movement. I think the word migration is so politicized, and it feels so scary and dangerous for lots of people to talk about, but movement isn't anything to be afraid of. That's something that's happened for centuries. People have always moved and they will continue to move, and actually an end to borders is the only way to ensure that we can adapt properly to the climate crisis. You know, borders just don't have a place in a globalized world, which allows the free movement of goods and services, but not people who choose or need to move. And so I think if we've learned anything from the last year and a half of amazing activism and the pandemic, is that we just don't have time to waste, and we can't afford to have solutions for some people but not everyone. So we have to have a vision that's global and brave and isn't afraid to call for action which really tackles the effects of the crisis and roots it in reality, as Asad said.
Brilliant, thank you, Minnie. I mean, anybody who knows anything about me will know that that was very much my hymn sheet you were singing from. So it's so good to get these, you know, all of these important perspectives and aspects of this crisis, because as it is so, you know, fundamentally threatening to everything about our societies, so does it actually impact everyone and needs to include everyone. That's so important. And I think what you were talking about with the way that we brutally restrict movement and how that links with the climate crisis and the COVID crisis is really, really important at this point as well, because I mean, the UK unfortunately sits with, I think, you know, the US and Sweden and maybe, you know, one or two others in a sort of shameful little group of people countries who have continued with deportations throughout this crisis, and who, you know, these, I mean, to say like anything except necessary travel, to say that deportations are just unnecessary goes so little of the way to address exactly, I think, those issues you've been talking about. And I think that we need to really push at this moment to challenge deportations, and link it with the crisis and the pandemic and the global health crisis, as you've quite rightly defined, the climate crisis. So thank you, all three of you, really given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our attendees as well. Now I'm going to, you will please all try to forgive me because I haven't done this before online. I'm going to try really hard to let everybody, you know, fairly get a word in, everybody who wants to contribute. Obviously, we love questions, but we are also interested to hear comments and perspectives from all of our participants. So I hope that by now enough of you have done enough of these to know, but you can, if you go to the participants tab on the right, so you click on that at the bottom of your screen, you can see, and you can raise your hand digitally if you would like to make a contribution or ask a question of our brilliant panel. And I will try to then hand you the mic. So yes, please do think of contributions. I'm going to abuse my chair's prerogative and ask question 2, which I had written down, so I now have to find it. Ah, yes. So it's in terms of this leadership question and where we're at in terms of, like, you know, the movements that Jonathan in particular sort of referenced, these movements from below, as compared to this leadership around the world that is so, well, not what we'd want. But at the moment in the UK, I mean, we may have a government that is completely antithetical to all of the things that we think need to happen in response to this crisis. But we do also have a government that has shown itself to be a governance by sort of PR, and doesn't seem to have a policy program that can withstand even, you know, a couple of days of intense media pressure on repeated issues. And whether actually, you know, viewing this government as a sort of strongman government is maybe a bit of a mistake, and how can we abuse that key weakness they have of being too populist for their own good, and falling into how can we get that pressure to impact on, to bring climate issues hopefully on some U-turns on that. And I'm going to leave that one question hanging there, and then I'm also, there is a hand up. We have a hand up, and we have some questions in the chat. So I'll give the floor to Luke, and then I'll maybe read some out from the chat as well. Luke, go ahead. You are permitted to talk. I think you also have to unmute.
Hi everyone, thanks so much. That was such a great set of introductions. And my question is like a tactics and strategy question, because I love, obviously, the global Green New Deal, like that massive big internationalist vision. Of course we need that, but is there a danger sometimes in pitching stuff at the absolute global level, because getting agreement, as we see at an international level through over 2 decades or so with climate change, has proven massively difficult? And how do we connect that global big vision to taking steps within nation states wherever possible? You know, if we get a breakthrough in, you know, Scotland, if we get a breakthrough in Greece or whatever, that's also fantastic. So I'm just thinking about how you could link together on a range of these issues, including on immigration as well, right? I mean, I totally agree, a borderless world, but how do we connect that internationalist fight to making the breakthroughs we need on a local and national level?
Great question. Thank you, Luke. I'm just going to also read one from the chat, and then I'll let you guys maybe tackle them. And you're just going to have to disorderly jump in and take it on, because I'm not going to try to police that. So I have a question here from the chat from Peter Murray. He asks, can there be a just free movement of goods? Any attempt to deal with climate change needs to involve reduction in international trade in order to reduce the carbon footprint. How can this be done without worsening global inequality? So I think that speaks a lot to some of the things that came up, particularly with what Asad said. So let's start with those, and please do keep your questions coming either in the chat or by raising your hand.
Shall I step up? I just want to say, Asad and Minnie, I just feel like I should actually just butt out and let you talk, because it was brilliant. And some really great challenges from you both. Thank you for the Green Party. I guess that those questions touch a little bit on leadership and what we can do and what is achievable. And we're always in the Green Party and trying to struggle as a smaller party within what's politically possible and what we think we can get done and what we think we can change. And to see an internationalist vision and think about that internationalist action is hard when you're even just trying to get small change at the national level. On your question of leadership, Zoe, it strikes me that a push point here is to just challenge the idea that this government is economically competent in any shape or form. What we've seen in what happened over just test trace and isolate just in the last 48 hours in Serco, highlights that outsourcing is an admission that you can't take responsibility yourself as a government in a crisis. It's an absolute hands up saying we can't deal with this when you outsource to someone like Serco. It's a monumental failure of leadership. And we've seen government step in and take railways into public ownership. Who would have thought that was possible 6 months ago and it would happen? But the government has done it because it recognised that it needed to. And I think we can kind of use those levers to undermine that narrative that the Conservatives are economically competent, which they've tried to push for so long. They just haven't. And what Asad pointed out, the choice is not monetarism or Keynesianism. It's a completely new way of looking at economics. On the internationalism point, we have worked with other Green parties across Europe. So one of the first things we did in the coronavirus crisis was to have a big conversation with the leaders of other Green parties. And that's one of the first points they were making was there is a power grab going on under emergency situations, emergency powers in a lot of countries to centralize power, particularly with the new authoritarian right trying to use the emergency powers to impose agendas that they've had already. And then there was the competition over PPE and the whole European project, in a sense, being threatened even more than it already is and breaking down because countries are competing against one another and borders are going up. Around that was immediately a red flag for us, and so we're looking at ways of how we could try and overcome that, encourage a sense of solidarity even within Europe. I think that the challenge from Asad is when we can't maybe work internationally is to factor international considerations much more into our policy making and to make those arguments that Minnie was advancing as well around movement. We've long said, just occurred to me as I was saying, just a simple practical way. I'm a politician, I'll try and deal with pragmatics. When everyone's saying we just need to shift our cars from fossil fuel cars to electric cars, and we've been saying, but of course it takes 9 to 12 tons of carbon to produce one electric car. But then there's also the whole issues of extraction, which Asad has flagged, minerals, and where you take those minerals for all the batteries that have been created in the cars, and the additional exploitation. And so we can use those points and arguments, I think, much more effectively, and it bolsters the points that we are making about how fundamental and how complete the reform needs to be of every transformation of every sector of the economy. And we can employ those internationalist arguments even if we can't have the international action. And just the last point, and we've always said as part of the international Green New Deals and the domestic Green New Deals that the root is a shift of power. And that's why, at a very local level, with all the climate emergencies that will be declared in local authorities, we're saying there needs to be citizens' assemblies. And I think the mutual aid that we've seen during this crisis does give more authority, more power to calling for citizens' assemblies way beyond just the climate emergency, but looking at every area of how we run local government and bringing more powers down to local government. And we've seen in this crisis that highlighted, the fact that local authorities haven't been given control over track and trace, but it's been outsourced. The fact that local authorities haven't had the powers to take control and close roads and transform the transport in the local area in the way they should. The fact that they've been starved of funding. The fact that they are the bodies that are closest to local people and they can identify the need most effectively. You know, there are many, many arguments about devolution of power. So there's, at the same time as working internationally, devolving power down to local communities, but also recognizing that there needs to be that global shift of power at the same time.
Great stuff. Thank you, Jonathan. Let's bring in Minnie now. Any thoughts on those questions we've had so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with what Jonathan says about how you have to bring the international fight here if you can't work in as much in cooperation as you could globally. But it is about recognizing, I think we just have to, we don't do it to the extent that we have done before, that we're doing now, which is that we do just need to take the experiences of people and put them directly into policy making, because for so long we have ignored that. We've been sort of fighting two battles where it's, you know, we're trying to think about the effects on us rather than the effects on people. So I take the comment that it's really hard to achieve significant change, but for me a lot of that comes down to working together more effectively as well. For me, I always feel like change is best achieved when everyone is coordinating around the same goals and trying to reach the same outputs, which is that we need radical change. We haven't been asking for that radical change for a really long time, so we don't necessarily even know whether that would have an effect on the ground. And I think the last year of activism has shown that more people are interested in the kind of radical change that's needed than have ever been before. So that I would agree mostly with what Jonathan's saying, and I just think that we need to collaborate more effectively if we're going to ever reach a stage where a globalized vision is achieved.
Thank you very much. And Asad, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's huge challenges, right? But there are the reason why I picked my first intervention in that way was because I think there has to be a starting point. So we have to embed some truths. So how and what we do at a national or local level has to be commensurate with the challenges that we face. If they're done in abstract, then often we're fighting side battles without actually fighting the real battle. So for me, you embed the anchor the facts at the top, and then you develop policy demands that flow from it. Look, there was a question there about, you know, can we have I suppose localized or regional economies? But I mean, that was the demand of the anti-imperialist movements, of the anti-colonial struggles. The reason why Lumumba was overthrown on Mossadegh is because they were talking about the control of resources, and corporations wanted to, of course, control those very same resources, and they created a global economy which relies on commodities. Now, but there are some truths. Like, look, let's just look at food, right? I said 2 billion people have issues around hunger, right? We can feed the world 3 times over. That and the amount of food that we produce. 80% of the world is fed by small farmers. Those small farmers rely on only 4%. In Africa, it's 19%, and in some places 11%. The rest of that land is used for commodities to the global north, for the global supply chains. So I think we can rethink and say there are enough resources for us. The question is about control of them. That's why I think we have to talk about land, water, food, energy as public goods. And I think the challenge we've got in terms of, it's an incredible one. And I think we're in a moment where maybe it's changing, but for a long time, neoliberalism affected our own imaginations. We couldn't imagine anything different, right? What we imagined was some reforms to neoliberalism. We couldn't imagine that there could be an alternative to it. And I think at this moment, what is required from us is bold visions. And then you fight for it. The reason why we're not able to win at the global level on climate, it's not because, it's a simple question. It's because we don't have sufficient power. And when you think about why don't we have sufficient power, then you have to say, how do we address not having sufficient power? And we know that the climate movement by itself can't win. We know that all of these movements by themselves can't win. They need a kind of movement and an intersectional approach that that says, here's where we want to get to. Here are the most transformational demands that we've got to all unite. So no matter if I'm fighting around migration, my fight still has to echo and be a part of another box. Because if we simply see a migration fight outside of the fight for economic inequality and the climate crisis, we're already failed. Right? Now, I'm totally agree with everything that Minnie was saying about the right to move. But, you know, we also have to fight for the right of people not to move, right? If you look at the majority of people who are being displaced and who will be displaced, 1 in 30 people in the world will be forcibly displaced from their home. The overwhelming majority of them will be displaced inside a poorer country or across border to another poorer country. They'll never come to Europe. They'll never come to any rich countries. And what do they need? We know that the most important demands that people have that determine both your experience of migration and your survival of migration is around whether you have access to public services, health, education, housing, whether you have income, whether you have social protection. Those are the critical things. So I think we have to start talking about really survival migration. These are not people moving for a paycheck. They're moving because our businesses, our corporations, our economy is displacing people in our climate crisis. So the answer also, you know, I mean, it's not going to be that millions and millions of people are going to massively move from the global south to the global north. I mean, what's more likely is many of us said a decade ago, I remember doing climate talks a decade ago and saying, there'll come a time when Europe will be machine gunning migrants in the Mediterranean. And people said, that will never happen. I will never. We're the bastion of liberalism. You know, you can't over exaggerate. And now what we sit silently by while migrants drown in the Mediterranean. We don't even know the names of any of the majority of people there. The idea that the walls and fences are something that's going to come, I think, is a reality that's already there. So I just maybe end on one thing. We've seen in the last few weeks the power of a social movement in transforming a national conversation, in making radical demands. Like, who would have imagined that discussion around defunding the police would be center stage in the United States? But it has been put there because the movement didn't start from a position of saying what is politically possible. They said what is needed for our communities and then built power around it. I think we've got to do the same. Before Corona pandemic did the lockdown, remember just even 6 months ago, Lebanon was in flames with social protests, Iraq, Chile, in so many parts of the global south, there were huge protests around inequality. And those protests are already starting to happen again. So how are we harnessing those back? And one of the things I think what's happened, again, largely because of sort of how UK movements and European movements have operated and the NGO sector has operated, they've siloed many of our movements and our issues. So if you fight climate, you're over here, there's a bunch of people fighting on poverty, a bunch of people on there. That was never the frame for movements in the global south, who always had an approach that connected these things together and built and said, you know, you can't fight for climate justice without fighting for economic justice. And I think we're in that moment now where over the next 18 months, if we aren't able to have an intellectual frame, look, we know there are 1,000 decisions we've got to undo about neoliberalism. And it used to be the slogan in the alt-globalization movement when we were marketing about the WTO, you know, one no, many yeses. The problem is we've got so many bloody yeses that, you know, it confuses people. So what are the top 6, 7 things that we actually should fight for? So I think they are, right? We have to fight. We have to fight in a way also that is not other, not or. So if we know that the fight in the UK is going to be around a living wage, so we should be saying absolutely a real living wage here for a global living wage everywhere else. If we're going to fight for public services here, it should be public services here, universal public services, not an or a sideline issue or at the bottom of the end of a demand, but integrated demands that demand what we're demanding here and connecting it globally. Because I am not only an optimist, but I actually believe in the solidarity of working people. And for all the ills that we talk about in this country, you know, for all of the statues of the slave traders, you know, there are also incredible moments, you know, during the cotton famine in Lancashire, from where I grew up, I'm proud of that bit of Lancashire, you know, the merchants in Liverpool built warships to break the blockade to be able to bring cotton from slave-producing states in the south. But cotton workers in Lancashire who were destitute refused to handle cotton from slave trade, saying we have solidarity. We've seen this all the way through history. I mean, on the banners of trade unions, it doesn't say workers of England unite or workers of the UK unite. It says workers of the world unite. So bringing a race, class, gender analysis into our movement, I think is a really critical thing, because if we don't, we can see what's coming over the edge of the precipice. And I have a real worry, because when you look at, for example, what the Chancellor is talking about, I mean, he's actually used the word a green industrial revolution. He's used that word. They're using the green word. If we split off the green fight from the economic inequality and global fight, I think there's a danger that people will say, well, aren't we doing this, right? Because they are already caught in. And I'm just going to end with that one last sentence. Last year, we brought communities from Brazil, Chile, Colombia to the AGM of BHP Billiton, one of the world's largest mining companies in the world, in their AGM. And we had these powerful testimonies of these communities about the destructive nature of these extractivism. And the CEO of BHP responded and said, we are part of the green stimulus. We are needed for the green revolution. This is BHP already repositioning themselves because they know that this green demand is coming. So if we don't internationalize it, I think we're in danger of winning a battle but losing the war. So I don't think we have any other option but to be an internationalist movement if we're really serious about tackling these multiple crises.
Thank you, Asad, and thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it might be in part sort of an issue as well around how the NGO movement is structured in this country, because we are not allowed, literally not allowed to talk about other elements of, like, the political roots of other intersecting issues with our own in the migrant movement. It's not appropriate for us to start talking about capitalism in terms of our funding structure and in terms of the charity sort of sphere and how it's structured here. So it hamstrings us to a large degree. And I think, it is important for us to recognize that exactly what you're saying about this right to not move. I mean, I will say, and Minnie will say, and all of us will, until the end of the world, that migration is natural and good and has always and will always happen, and that's right. But it is not natural and normal historically for vast movements from the global south to the global north to be necessary and to be happening on this scale. Like long distance migration is a vastly growing phenomenon, and it's based around these global inequalities that we need to be able to name within the migration movement and to work alongside the activists who are working on those specific issues. And we need to find ways of moving beyond sort of just talking about it in terms of our direct area, because otherwise we're worried about overstepping the mark and worrying funders and so on. And obviously the solution to that, I hope it doesn't need to be said to this group, is not to limit migration opportunities and the rights of migrants in the global north from the global south, but it is to address the global inequalities and the global threats that force these movements to happen in a way that is not ideal. The ideal is people being free to move, but generally speaking, people choose to move in circular ways, within their area. And that's the kind of migration that ideally we want to have on a larger scale. Now, I had a hand up, it has gone down. I have various questions that I have been noting in the chat. I would recommend, there's lots of useful links and helpful stuff that people have been sharing in the chat, so do take a look. I've got a couple more. I'm gonna do, because we've gone on for a while now, I'm gonna do one last round of questions from the chat. If you have something burning to say, raise your hand now, and I'll also bring you in at this point, and then I'll ask the panel to wrap up for about 12:30 if we can manage that around then. So what I have, we have Richard back with his hand up. Thank you, Richard, for coming back. I'm going to allow you to talk now and ask your question. I also have to unmute you.
There we go.
There we go.
Hi, thank you. So I think we all agree that we need to organize the different movements, under one banner. There's always been a challenge to find a common message for political movements. And I think we can also see that, like with Black Lives Matter, that it's a movement that's been going on for quite some time, as you can tell from the States, and it's been localized, then nationalized. But it wasn't until you had this global uprising that people really took notice. And I guess my question is, how do we get about this? And also, how do we control the media? Because, you know, we talked about the rise of the right wing and the messaging, and also this goes to climate change. We've seen how the message has been completely distorted, and the arguments have been changed. And this goes to, we saw this with the elections here and in the States with social media. And so how do we take control of the message and control of the media? Because I think that if we do, it's like in the States, there was no communication between the workers in Mexico of GM and the workers in North America, that they were both being hit with the same cuts in wages. And was like finally when they communicated, they fought together and went on strike. So how do we get that the message out? How do we take control of the media? How do we own the message and then get all of the movements that we're seeing around the globe today to unify, to say, because we do, I think everyone understands we do have the same, all the issues that all the panelists spoke about. It's the history of colonialism, exploitation of rights and resources, and moving towards a unified global population.
Thank you.
So my question is, how do we take control of the message and get that organized movement that we all would like to see?
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that. I love that question. It always comes up. It is a very good and important one, but it is sort of like, how do we fix it as well? So I wish you luck to respond to that. I'm also going to add some of the questions that we've seen in the chat. I'm sorry if I've missed ones from the chat, but you can always put your hand up. So I have spotted a couple where I thought it'd be really interesting to get your perspectives on. So I think a couple of people brought up the question of the current merging of DFID and the FCO. And I've read a little bit about it. It does seem to be something that's it's not one of the back of a fag packet sort of announcements. It does seem to be very much going to happen. And how do you see that playing out? How do you see that impacting on development budgets and the use of development money for green projects? Do you see that as being in any way an opportunity or not, as the case very much may be? Another question I've seen is about migration and development, and about how the migrant movement, migration rights movement is international in certain areas and places, but also how the UK migration movement doesn't seem to have so far successfully really made a mark on those issues. And I think I'd add sort of my own question onto that about like how the global impact of our migration policies is very unknown. And while we're fighting for the rights of migrants here, you know, the European Union and the UK, both individually and in a sick dance together, you know, directly intervene in migration management around the world and link migration management accords to development funding, you know, development which seems to be the development of borders. And how can we combat that, and what are your thoughts on that, and on how we can reclaim sort of development money for just green transition? No, I will never stop banging on about that issue, ever. Yes, I think if you can address some of those issues and also sort of round up And I'm giving a last call out for anyone with a burning contribution to make to raise their hand now, or just be ready for them to wrap up. Okay, we're going to let you wrap up. So please, yeah, try to respond to both Richard's questions and the ones I noted from the chat, and also just your closing thoughts, please. Thanks. Oh, I'll give you an order. We'll go the other way around this time. So Asad first, please.
Thanks. There were quite a lot there. So look, we all know that when we're building movements and building power, sometimes it's the easiest thing to do is the no, right? Resistance is always easier, and it's powerful. But when you build transformation, you have to have a vision, right? People have to be able to see themselves in a vision, and you have to be able to articulate the vision. And I think for a long time, our movements have lost the ability to be able to describe the world that we want, not in abstract terms, but you know, like what the utopia, but actually be able to allow the majority of the world's citizens to see themselves in that vision. And I think that's really important. So, you know, one of the things I always like, we stop talking about everything is about less, right? Actually, we should be thinking about everything is better, that we're meeting the needs of people. And I think it's important because we vacated a lot of the spaces globally. If you look at the rise of the populist right, often the rise of the populist right is because the left is retreated from doing the hard work of building solidarity, of doing frontline work. You look at the rise of the BJP in India, you look at the rise of every, providing the clinics, the schools, they're in the places which were traditionally how the left built its power 100 years ago. I think there are a lot for us to say about how you have to be both a global in your vision, but local and national in your practice, and what solidarity, building solidarity, it means. I think what, you know, as War on One, look, we're a radical charity, 100% charity, right? We talk about neoliberal capitalism. We talk about all of those things because we fight the Charity Commission on the right to be able to say all of those things. I think for too long, the NGO sector in this country has been too timid, right? It frames as what it thinks is acceptable to say, not what is needed to be said. And our very reason for existing is to say what is needed to be said and build power around it. But there is very practical things that we can do. We work a lot historically with garment workers, and we've always been working saying it's not possible to fight for a living wage here and ignore garment workers. What we should be talking about is how do we build living wages for garment workers and workers' rights in Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, etc., but also connect it to the fight with low-paid workers in the shops here. How do you build new solidarities for unions through these supply chains? And now finally, there are more work that's taking place at the international level between trade unions, where they're saying, look, we have to fight across a whole supply chain and make demands for all workers, so that we don't just win for some workers in a supply chain, we're actually winning for all workers there. And I think there are some important lessons for us to be able to have. Look, and I just want to also say, you know, both with Zoe, Minnie, and generally with JCWI, it's, you know, fighting on migration, I think, has historically always been the hardest issue, even for the progressive left to address. And so it's great, all the work that you do, but it has to be central to our fight, because if we ignore it, we know it's always been said, you know, what's happening on migration, what's happening both knowledge about what is practiced there, about the logic of incarceration, is what is then flows through to the rest of society as well. We always used to say, you know, many years ago in the 1980s, you know, what was tested on the bodies of black people would then be rolled out to be tested on every rest of society. We talked about that in policing, talked about incarceration, in detention, and all of those things. So I very much agree with Minnie. Unless we embed these demands into our agenda, we do get this weird thing that you can see a victory about Heathrow on its carbon footprint, but carry on with its role in terms of the deportation of people. Look, I was at the Global Compact on Migration a couple of years ago, and I was shocked that the majority of the discussion, even amongst the most progressive elements or the liberal elements, was all about, you know, safe and secure. It's about best practice. Nothing about actually tackling what are the root causes in terms of around migration, because that requires an analysis of structural, about the economy, and about ultimately about capital as we know it, and we have to shift the debate there. And I would just remind people, you know, at WTO, you know, wherever now it's been, I forgot, 20 years since we were at WTO. I can't even remember how long ago. My memory is so old age now. But there, we were able to unite the labour movement, the environment movement, social justice movements, movements of the global south, and they shifted northern civil society profoundly. And we managed it. Okay, it was, you know, sidelined when the war on terror started, and it broke that unity, and it created a whole new challenges, but it shows it can be done. We can shift what the anchor of every discussion is. But to be able to do that, I think you have to have a political agenda. And I go back to, you know, why we're working on a radical global Green New Deal, why we think that's very much part of it, and of course migration and the right and survival migration is all part of it. I'm really an optimist, and I think, you know, this is a question not just of abstract optimism, but as I said, I think it's because we have to move the conversation from a just transition to a justice transition. We have to start moving from, you know, lifting the shackles that are on our own imaginations and our own ability to be able to connect. And there are lots of dynamic things that are happening all over there. I saw some of the things that have been mentioned in the chat. I think that's all there. And we're working a lot with our movements in the global south. And I'd say the two things that have always come from movements in the global south, the challenge has always been, is where is the movement in the global north? And I have to say, I remember a call straight after Extinction Rebellion was on the street, and the youth climate strikers were like, great, there's an amazing movement, finally, after all of this time. And then the next call was, why are they taking roads and bridges? Why aren't they going after the banks and corporations? So I think we also have to say, it's not simply about building a movement, it's about how you use the movement to affect change, what it targets, and why it targets, and what real solidarity looks like from a global perspective. But it's all possible, and it's up to all of us, because it's our responsibility. It's not going to happen by anybody else, but all collectively. And that's why I'm a great fan of the work that Another Europe is possible, because we know, you know, this is the hard slog of movement building, and we have to do it, and we have to be the people who are constantly drawing all of these threads together and then propagating that back out, because one of our jobs is political education. It's gone in this country to a large extent. And it's a real job for all of us as political activists to do that political education.
Yes, yes, it is our job, and we can do it. That is the messages that we need. Thank you so much, Asad. Let's go to Minnie now.
Yeah, so I think on the question about like media and narrative, I just want to say that I think particularly when it comes to migration, the problem has been is that we have, in the last 10 to 15 years at least, probably more, have never wanted to present our own stories collectively about migration. We have very much been responding to right narratives and trying to win that argument in a disorganized, unclear, and really not very radical way. We've been very afraid to say that people are people and people move, and that is fine. And I think that reclaiming that and presenting our own stories and finding our own way to tell the stories and put people at the forefront, people who've been affected, migrants themselves, let them tell the story in the way they want to tell it, is really important. We can't keep playing this game with the media where we're like, oh, we're afraid to say this, and actually the media might like to hear that, so we'll do X, Y, and Z as a response to that. We have to take our own initiative and allow people to speak on the issues that they want to speak on. And I think some of that problem links to the question that I think Don asked about the migrants' rights movement in the UK and how it doesn't appear to be connected internationally. Now, I think on the face of it, that is somewhat true. There are most certainly informal solidarity networks that exist with people in the global south, and obviously migrants themselves are inherently connected to the place where they came from, so those solidarity networks do exist. The problem that exists in the migrants' rights movement is that, one, it is heavily underfunded, it is siloed completely from other movements, and no one wants to stand up for migrants, unfortunately, so all those issues happen in isolation. And then you have the very specific problem, which is that migrants themselves, because of the hostile environment, are afraid to come forward and cannot come forward in many cases to talk about the issues that are affecting them. And therefore, the people who are inherently the people who should be talking about the issues find it difficult to speak for themselves. So there's like a balance there of needing resource and capacity, and also fundamentally shifting the system so that people are allowed to speak for themselves. And I think this speaks to some of the work that Zoe and I are currently doing, and JCWI is doing, on a New Deal for migrants, which also speaks to what Asad just mentioned about connecting workers' rights and union rights, and making sure that work is also part of that conversation, because even if people are undocumented, they will be carrying out various types of work that need to be formalized. And when people are working and have workers' rights, they can be more visible in those conversations. So what we are planning as part of that New Deal for migrants is focusing very much on the work economy and how that fits, and how we can unionize people and bring people to the forefront of the conversation so they can call for the things that they want to talk about. And that very much connects with how global vision of work and the impacts of the climate crisis on workers, and here and abroad. So yeah, I think if you are interested in sort of boosting the migrants' rights movement and connecting it better to the climate movement, you know, you have to think about how you can support individuals themselves and bring resource to the movement. And I think that's my final closing thought.
Thank you, Minnie. Give us money. Love it. Jonathan, can you close us down for today?
Will do. Thank you very much. And also thank you so much. I guess what's happened today, I'm going to come away from this feeling quite challenged in a very good way by Asad and Minnie, and that's really good for the Green Party. I wanted to kind of link it back to what we've kind of seen over the last few years in terms of challenging one another. Zoe, you talked about operating within the constraints as an NGO and how hard it is. I'm reminded, you know, the Bishop of Oxford had to take on the Church of England and take the Church of England to court back under apartheid South Africa to win the right, as himself a church commissioner, to get the right to disinvest in apartheid South Africa. And that was a landmark ruling that changed charity funding and the divestment movement. And sometimes you have to take on your own organizations to bring about the change. And, you know, I'll open and honestly, within the Green Party, there's a debate about population going on right now, which is very pertinent to this conversation. And I'll have to say I'm on Asad and Minnie's side on this, but it's something that we're going to have to win. But often it's movements which are challenging the NGOs. And think about how Extinction Rebellion emerged and what gap it was filling, was that the traditional environmental NGOs had always had the idea that if you tell people what the real situation is and you're too radical about it, you won't get people to come along with you. People will think it's too much and will go home. And Extinction Rebellion kind of chucked that out the window and said, no, the house is on fire. We have to act now. And they brought that in. And now, of course, we've seen the NGOs change and take that on board. I was sitting in the House of Commons in the 1990s working for a bunch of MPs, and I got a letter across my desk from a guy in Scotland, an academic. So I've got this great idea. What about cancelling the debts of the most indebted countries in the year 2000? And I nearly fell off my chair laughing, because no one was talking about it. None of the parties were. And within 6 or 7 years, the Jubilee campaign had become the Jubilee Coalition, and they got churches and trades unions and NGOs and individuals. And you know, there was the big G8 meeting, and they circled around Birmingham. And okay, it wasn't as much as everyone wanted, but and Pettifor led it, and they got debt cancelled. And you know, within 6 or 7 years, they moved from it being nowhere on the political agenda to every political party saying, how can we do this? And the G8 sitting around not saying, can we cancel debt and do anything well, but whose country's debt are we going to cancel? And with that, I've always carried with me, because at the same time, around that time, one of my heroes in the House of Commons was Tony Benn. He said, when he retired, I'm leaving the House of Commons to concentrate on politics. And it was his conviction that movements change things. They shift the Overton window. And right now, what gives me so much hope is that we're seeing a lot of seismic change, a lot of movements emerging very, very quickly. You know, we saw Occupy emerge in 2008, 2010. I got dragged off the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral during the Occupy evictions, but then that kind of petered out. But then we saw, you know, a massive surge to the Green Party over our anti-austerity stance when no one else was taken up. We saw a massive surge to the SNP. and a huge electoral success even under first past the post. We saw the Corbyn surge. We've seen the school strikers come out. We've seen Black Lives Matter. And these are very powerful movements that are actually having very significant change. And so, when we talk about all the inadequacies of the movement, we know that one of the frustrations is we can focus on the inadequacies, but we recognize that the change that we have to bring about has to happen and be completed within 8.5 years. That is, as Asad said at the beginning, it's a very, very short window. And this is not a time to not be bold and not be radical. We have to be saying it very, very strongly, but we have to articulate a vision. And I think just the one thing I want to leave, just echoing what Asad and Minnie have said, is that what people really need now is hope. And we're very, very good about saying what's wrong. And that needs to be said. And we actually need to get better about saying it still, about what is wrong. But more than that, we need to articulate the vision of what is right and the kind of world, and be confident in that vision, go out and make the case for that vision and show that there is an alternative to monetarism and Keynesianism, and that there is a new world that we can reimagine. And this, is the challenge that I'm going to take away. And just addressing the last question, hopefully I've addressed all the questions, was the one about communication and how we do that. I want to give a plug for Neon. I think they do a really great work in getting out some messaging. When the Prime Minister was sick with COVID, they produced some messaging which was really, really helpful to get all the NGOs and activists on side to say, don't get yourself into trouble here, or see the bigger picture. Don't go sounding off about the Prime Minister getting COVID. Be sympathetic. At other times around COVID, they produced some other really great messaging. They produced some great messaging around the Green New Deal and the vision. And we do need that coordinated messaging across NGOs to make sure that we are supporting one another in what we're saying and not contradicting or not creating a bad narrative, which is very hard for us to then get out of. And I think maybe there needs to be more investment as NGOs and political parties in that kind of coordinating messaging together. So a very practical solution, because my job is to be practical about these things as a politician. But hope and vision are the two things I'd leave us all with. We desperately need to work together to articulate them.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much to all our panelists. I'm really pleased that Another Europe asked me to chair this one, because I've really learned a lot, and I've also been inspired about the possibilities of seeing how these issues interact with the ones I know better, can and must lead to us, working in that solidarity, and that real change that we really need has to come from all of us together. So I'm really grateful for you all who have attended today. Thank you for your questions, your contributions. Of course, go out and join War on Want, go out and join JCWI, certainly go out and join Another Europe is Possible. We do lots of these. And all the movement building, and I can't say join the Green Party, I think, but it's not a bad idea either. And yes, let's keep in touch with these webinars. I love them; they're so great, and keep coming along, keep being part of the discussion, and solidarity and good night. And now I hope somebody from the tech side of things will actually end the meeting so it won't be awkward. No?